So can we start regarding that? What have you seen? You've been in practice for 30 years. So what have you seen that has led to that trend?
Well, I suppose you could say it's a perfect storm. And what that means is that children are under more stress than ever before. They are facing challenges that previous generations haven't faced. Everyone would like to say, oh, well, when we were kids. But the truth is that previous generations had their own stresses, whether it was war or political, strife but I think what they didn't have that we have today are things like, global warming, social media, a whole list of things that are more stressful, including more competition, much more competition for our kids than ever before. You'd say too many mice for the same cheese, and that makes it a more stressful and competitive world. And that puts pressure on them to seek a kind of adult-like accomplishment very early. So too much pressure on them academically as well. So, they're facing more, but we are dealing with children who are less emotionally secure. So I suppose you could say if you're going to impose more stress on a child, you have to make sure that they are as emotionally secure as possible, right? So you think
can I interject with that? Because in your recently published book, you did mention, I just want to read 2 sentences. You said, in the age of individualism and parents either having to or wanting to return to their own lives, work, and interests as quickly as possible, it is the attachment process that suffers the most. And attachment is related to emotional well-being. So we can talk about all the changes that's happening regarding work and relationship, the connectivity that we have with our children.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about where emotional security comes from. So if we're saying that children face more, but have less emotional security, which is the foundation for resilience to stress, then the next question would be, where does emotional security come from? And where does that ability to withstand stress and adversity and conflict, where does it come from? And the answer is, it comes from our very, very earliest experiences of security, meaning if we feel safe and secure, attached, protected, buffered from stress in the beginning. And by the beginning, I mean the first 1,000 days, or what we sometimes call the first 3 years of life, then we have more of a foundation of emotional attachment and emotional security to withstand the adversity and stress and conflict later. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. And I think it's misunderstanding, but it's also fiction. There's a lot of fiction about and fantasy about children being born strong and resilient, or to use a German word, starke. That there's a myth that children are born that way, and to varying degrees, and they're not. They're actually born incredibly neurologically fragile, emotionally and physically dependent for a very long time. And the way that we're organically built is that our right brain, or our social emotional brain, which controls everything in the future, from emotional regulation, resilience to stress, executive functioning, working memory, the ability to read social cues, the ability to feel empathy towards others or mentalize, all of these things live in the impulse control. It all lives in the right brain. So if we don't do it right in the beginning, if we don't provide that buffering from stress and emotional security and our physical and emotional presence as much as possible in the first 3 years, we basically have a child who is forced to create a kind of defensive structure to their personality. It's not that they don't seem to cope with what we're handing them, which is, putting them in institutional daycare or going back to work at 6 weeks, or it's not that they don't seem to hold it together. What they do is they create a defensive structure, what we call defensive independence, which makes them seem like they can handle more. But that makes them very vulnerable to breakdown, because a child who's emotionally secure really is built from the inside out and has a solid core of self. Whereas a child who's provided with less in the beginning has a hollow core and an outside shell. And that shell then becomes very vulnerable to breakdown and to adversity really collapsing that shell.
Yes. And what are some of those defense mechanisms that children might have? Because I don't think a lot of parents fully understand, as you mentioned, that the first 1,000 days or first 3 years are vital for the right brain development of our children. Some, as you mentioned in your book, some say it's the first 3 months, but it's way longer than that. So for those parents who are concerned, they might be expecting, or they might have a little one who's not 3 yet, and they want to make some corrections. What are some of those dependency mechanisms that children might exhibit as a way of protecting themselves because they do not get that secured attachment from their primary caregiver, mostly their mothers?
Well, I mean, if you look at other parts of the world, and that's changing rapidly, and sadly, it's changing. But if you look at other parts of the world, meaning they're following our model, which is really bad news. But if you look at other parts of the world, babies are carried on their mother's bodies for the first year. For the first year, babies actually have what we call skin-to-skin contact all the time. They're basically literally carried like papooses on the front, on the back, by their mothers. Their mothers will go and work in the fields in an agroeconomy. Their mothers will do cooking, carrying them on their back, or there's a lot of skin-to-skin contact with neonates. And the reason for that is that it reduces the stress. It buffers that baby from stress. It keeps the part of the brain that is the stress regulating part of the brain. There's a little almond shaped part of the brain that's one of the oldest part of the limbic system of the brain. It's called the amygdala, and it's meant to stay quiet and small and quiet, very diminutive. And it's not meant to be kind of turned on, if you will, until after a year. So in most parts of the world, there is an intuitive understanding that babies are fragile and that they need to have skin-to-skin contact to regulate their emotions and regulate their distress. And researchers who've done research on this, a woman named Judy Mesman, who's very famous in the field of, she's actually Dutch, and she's very famous in the field of sort of the sociology of mothering. So she travels around the world and she looks at mothering behaviors, and she sees whether mothering is universal in terms of its behavior or whether it is culturally relative. And what she found is it's actually universal, meaning that sensitive, empathic nurturing. But in other cultures, there's an understanding. If we keep the baby quiet and close to our bodies, we protect the baby from stress, they're going to be stronger in the long run. They're going to be physically stronger. We protect them from germs. We give them our immune system, but we also give them our psychic immune system. In our country, and I think in Western Europe and Western countries, I think what's happening is there's this myth, this belief that babies are strong and resilient and adult-like. We project onto them adult-like characteristics of independence and self-sufficiency and resilience. And it's all a bunch of baloney because they don't have any of those things. And so what they do is they develop what we call attachment disorders. There's different kinds of attachment disorders. I don't know if you want me to go into the different kinds of attachment disorders, but
we can mention two. Let's mention the two most prominent in case parents are listening and they're not aware of them. So they can at least have an idea to go and look on that further later
Sure.
on.
So one of the most common is something called avoidant attachment disorder, which is if you leave your baby too much or aren't present enough or are in and out, or you're distracted or you're depressed or you're home. You could be physically home and just be emotionally checked out or be physically unavailable to them while still being home,
Right.
What happens is the baby then says, right, my mommy is not going to take care of me. No one's going to take care of me. I guess I have to take care of myself. And they literally turn away from the mother. So they stop depending on the mother in the way that they need to depend on the mother to really develop that core of emotional security. And what that would look like is the mother will come in the room and the baby will turn away. Or if you pick a baby up from daycare, the baby will seem to not react to you coming to pick them up. And when you drop them off, the baby won't react and the baby will look away. It's literally like, mommy's not going to care for me, then I'm not going to think or worry about or be attached to mommy.
I'm protecting myself, so I'm not disappointed.
I'm protecting myself. That's right.
Yeah.
The other very common type is something called ambivalent attachment disorder, which is, how does it look? It's when you have a very anxious mother who's really fearful about attachment, and that baby, it can either develop because the mother has ambivalent attachment disorder and is a very anxious mother, and then the baby becomes very anxious and very clingy.